Good afternoon, I'm Karen Holmes Ward. When it comes to new developments, right now much of the attention is focused on the seaport. Glitzy new waterfront properties like the St. Regis are popping up in that newly developed neighborhood. The starting price, $2 million for a one-bedroom condo, but who can afford that? Critics say neighborhoods such as Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan need more development that won't price out longtime residents. Joining me now is Boston's first Chief of Planning, Arthur Jemison. He's an urban planner and an Amherst native. Welcome to Cityline. How are you today?
Thanks. So glad to be here.
Glad you're here. Mayor Michelle Wu has been a longtime critic of the Boston Planning and Development Agency, which replaced the Boston Redevelopment Authority, which you worked. You've been on the job for about a month now. What are your top priorities, and how is your leadership and planning guidance for the city going to change going forward?
So I think the way I think about my vision for the work we're trying to do is to cause the development review process. We have over 43 million square feet of commercial and residential development under review right now, is to really have that review led by plans. One of the challenges I think the city has had over the years is without having an updated zoning code, the development that people are seeing isn't often guided by sort of plans that have been laid out and codified in zoning. So the idea is to take some of the great work that's been done now, build on it, and take it all the way to and make it part of the zoning code. So that's a key part of it. I'd say the other key sort of issues that the mayor would like us to address would be making the development process much more accessible to Bostonians, creating a more transparent process where people can really understand and see how their input and the meetings they're going to translate into developments in their neighborhood. I think that we can do a better job with that and again, build on the efforts of the past.
This month, the mayor announced the results of an audit of city-owned land. It found that more than 1,200 parcels totaling 9.5 million square feet of vacant or underutilized property. Many of those parcels in Dorchester and Mattapan. Mayor Wu says the city plans to take advantage of that space and give communities what they need.
Vision, mixed use and affordable housing, upgrading city facilities, public green spaces. And we have an incredible opportunity right now to bring our neighborhoods closer and reimagine how we live, work, and come together as a city.
Now, you were at that press conference in Charlestown, and you note that the audit offered opportunities, but you focused on how those projects will be carried out.
We have, diversity, equity, and inclusion requirements associated with all of our dispositions now that really make a priority of having development teams that reflect every part of this city, teams that look like our city.
So how are you going to make that happen, and what does it look like?
So we have already advertised 16 different properties and selected developers for some of them, a few of the folks you'll be meeting shortly, in fact, where we make a requirement that everyone identify a diversity, equity, and inclusion plan in their submittal. And what we've done is we've made that now 25% of the scoring. So if you're a proposer and you'd like to develop some of the land that came through the land audit, you have to demonstrate you have a plan to cause your development to be diverse. And
what kinds of things are you looking for in that plan?
We're looking for, how are you going to deploy contractors, many of whom are minority or women contractors are owned by minorities or women. How are we going to deploy them in the construction of your project? How are we going to deploy them in the property management of your project? Are we going to deploy them in the repair or improvement, any of the components that go into the development? And then your tenants, how are you going to get a tenant profile that really looks like, reflects the way the city works? Those are the kinds of things that you have to do if you want to have a successful DEI plan that's going to get all the points in the competition.
When new buildings and development come to neighborhoods like Roxbury, I'll take, for instance, the plan for Nubian Square. We're going to talk to Richard Taylor in the next segment. How do you ensure that the projects align with the mayor's goal of creating a more equitable and resilient, transit-oriented and affordable city?
Well, I think you don't have to look too much further than the proposals that were selected. As Richard will tell you, he's got a proposal that's got significant affordability. It's got significant home ownership opportunities. He and his development company really represent the kind of development that developer that we're hoping to attract and bring into the conversation, so that the projects themselves are, think about the Roxbury Strategic Oversight Committee, they've been working on getting the Blair lot into the development market for a long time, and it's their guidance that brought us to the RFP. And it's and frankly, when you see someone like Richard going out to do the project, you see that all the way through the process, the kinds of inclusive, diverse goals we have are represented by the development itself.
Whenever there's development, there's always a concern, always a fear, particularly in communities of color, that development will light the match that sparks gentrification. How do you manage to keep prices at a level where longtime residents can afford to stay in the city?
So it's a major concern of ours. One of the things we wanted to do, and the land audit is an example of it, is say there is a pipeline of development that we can create and control, that we can make sure includes the kind of affordability we want. So the land audit, which just for our portion, the 250 properties, that putting that land into the marketplace and requiring that it be affordable is one of the ways that we're going to be able to make sure that the larger marketplace does continue to contain the kind of properties people need to have. And I think further, working closely with the Mayor's Office of Housing, we are working hard to make sure that people who are in properties have all the support they need to stay in them, so that they don't have to feel like they've got to leave. They can stay, in fact, and take advantage of the benefit of the neighborhood's hopefully positive change.
That we'll quickly turn to the Dorchester Bay City development on what was once the Bayside Expo Center. Kirk Sykes again joining us in the next segment. Critics again say there are not enough affordable units in that development. And are not truly affordable to residents, and that they're concerned again about displacement in the area. I guess you would offer the same response in terms of keeping that neighborhood affordable for residents. So,
as developers will tell you, we have a very complete process of reviewing proposals like Kirk's, to make sure that it's sort of we've done all of the basic Article 80 analysis of what the project's impacts are going to be, including describing and fully describing and understanding the affordable housing and the phasing that the project would have. That project has both residential as well as commercial uses, and we're in a process of scoping the project, as we say, reviewing it for all of the impacts it's going to have. And so we've been in discussion with the developer about that, and are communicating with them about the things that we're expecting them to do. We've definitely heard the concerns of the community. I don't have to go much further than the Dorchester Day Parade or any of the other neighborhood meetings I do to hear about the concerns. So we're going to be responsive to those.
We are rounding out the segment. We're talking a lot about waterfront development, climate change, rising sea levels are now factoring into the development process. We have images of flooded spaces in brand new seaport development from 2018, images that are hard to forget. Waterfront development plans are going to have to take climate change into account. Where's the City of Boston on this issue?
So I actually have a perspective on this from working at HUD, where part of my department included the area where all of the climate change resources, frankly, they don't call them climate change resources, but their disaster recovery resources are located. So the view I would share with you is that I think the agency's done great work in identifying what improvements need to be made to protect the city from the shoreline, in particular, from water coming in. There's costs, though, to do that, and in some times asking developers to share in those costs in different ways is part of it. But I think we really need to take a thoughtful and sort of forward-looking approach where we think, how do we actually mobilize all of the building talent in our community to potentially make investments in those resilience efforts in advance, but instead of just asking our development partners to do it? I'd really like to find ways to do that, because I think we're in a better position than some other communities in terms of understanding where those areas of risk are and how to mitigate it.
All right, Arthur Jimison, thanks for being here to share with us your vision for the city.
What a pleasure to be with you today.
We hope you come back again.
I will.
All right. Next, two minority developers who are working on transformational projects in Boston neighborhoods. A look at the challenges and the opportunities next on City.